Hello, my name is Raqi Syed. I am speaking to you from Wellington, New Zealand, and I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Audria, for inviting me.
You're very welcome. So tell us, what do you do and how did you start your journey?
What do I do? So I am a visual effects artist, although now I do a lot of other things. So I started my journey really young, actually. I fell in love with animation when I was 12 years old because I had the unique experience of going to a public school that had an animation program in junior high. And then I went to a high school that had a really amazing animation program. It was Roland High School in Southern California, San Gabriel Valley. And we got taught by these amazing mentors who came to this weird little high school in the middle of nowhere. So people like Chuck Jones came, Kathleen Kennedy came to our open houses. We had, animators from The Simpsons coming and doing portfolio reviews. So it was like really inspiring. And the cool thing is that that program was started by someone named Dave Masters, who was an old school union organizer, like a hippie. And he just decided as a high school teacher that he was going to do something really subversive and revolutionary. And he was going to teach animation and filmmaking to kids in the middle of this suburb, kids that had no access to Hollywood or even reason to believe that they could make films. And he was going to teach us how to do it. And he did. So that really made me fall in love with animation at a very early age. And after that, I knew that I wanted to go to film school. So I went to a proper film school, learned about film history, and then did a master's degree in animation and digital arts. And again, like I was lucky because I had these amazing teachers like Christine Panushka, who used to be at Cal Arts back in the day, came to USC and started a new animation program. And she also had kind of a subversive idea, which was that you could take the idea of traditional character animation and experimental animation. And at Cal Arts, those two things have always been taught separately, but mix them up and ask students to use both of these ways of making animation and telling stories to combine them. And so that program was run by feminists. And it was like a really eye-opening experience for me because it took all this love that I had for animation and it put it into this context of like telling an embodied story, telling it from the perspective of like feminism, from gender, from sexuality. And by the time I left USC, I had all these amazing ideas about animation. I also knew that I wanted to do computer animation, but I didn't have a ton of skills. Like I had a lot of ideas and not a lot of skills. So somehow I ended up getting a job at Disney Feature Animation as an assistant TD. And that was also cool and a little bit unusual because Disney, of course, has this amazing history of making feature animated films. But at that time, which was the early 2000s, they were transitioning into computer graphics. And so they were making their first CG animated film, which was Chicken Little. And they were kind of like in this unique position of being a studio that has lots of legacy and resources, but was operating in a kind of indie experimental way because they had never done this before. Of course, there was Pixar, but the two studios were very separate at that time. So that was an amazing learning opportunity. And I met a lot of people that I ended up working with for many years ever since, made some really great friends and learned a lot about like, okay, what does it mean to be useful to the production process in a computer graphics pipeline? And so I learned how to TD, I learned how to problem solve and debug, and also be inspired by the art of animation. And then I'm like really condensing the story, but then after that, a few years later, I got invited to go to New Zealand to come to Weta Digital and be a lighting technical director there. So at Disney, I had sort of worked my way up from being an ATD to a look dev TD. And I always knew that I wanted to work as a lighter because there's something really interesting about the person that it's like this role where you're a cinematographer and you're a gaffer. So it's like kind of very artistic, but also very grunty, like you're literally just placing the lights sometimes and solving problems. And at Weta, they expected you to not only be a technical person, but also an artistic person. So at Disney, at that time, it was quite separate roles. So we had the technical people like me who were supporting the artists. But at Weta, they were like, well, you know how to light, right? And you know how to run your own shots, right? And I was like, yeah. So what I learned in my years at working in visual effects was like, what does it mean to embody both of these positions, being a technical person and an artistic person, and to develop my eye for how do you create a beautiful image and how do you work backwards from that? How do you know when it's not working, and what is the language around making a visual image better or critiquing it? Yeah. And so then after that, after a bunch of films, bunch of Marvel films, bunch of like 3 Hobbits, I decided it was time for a change. And in between that time period, I had done a master's degree at Victoria University, another master's degree in creative writing. And I had written a story about my family. And that was almost like, it was like emerging from the matrix. Like once you're out, once you've written a story about yourself, you can't unwrite it. You can't go back to like not thinking about telling your own story. So it became this thing that started to haunt me. And I left visual effects to sort of focus on writing that story again, redrafting it a couple times. And in that time period, I got approached by Victoria University to do some teaching for them. Just so happened that they were starting this new program, which is a master's program for visual effects. And so I came back to Miramar because there's like this force that exists underneath the surface of Miramar and it keeps pulling you back in. So I'm still here in Miramar, but now I'm working with the next generation of artists. And I also get to do other cool stuff. Like I'm a researcher, so I get to spend at least half of my time working on my own projects. So I get to be an independent artist and a teacher. And I think about like, what is the medium of visual effects? How can it be an art medium? How can we do new things with it? So in that respect, I've sort of turned my attention to virtual reality and making some of my own projects. So my partner and I co-directed an experience called Minimum Mass a couple of years ago, which played at a bunch of festivals last year. Started off at Tribeca, went to Venice, Annecy, a bunch of other places. And that was like really rewarding because that answered that sort of ghostly haunting that was coming up over and over again. Like, what are you doing with your storytelling? Like, are you telling your own story? How can you use this medium to do something unique and interesting? Like all the things that all my teachers over the years, Dave Master, Christine Panushka, Kathy Smith, like these people that wanted us to think about animation as a medium for storytelling. All of these things have started to sort of align a little bit more now that I'm in this next phase of my career. I would tell my younger self not to worry so much about like a thing that's always scared me, even from when I was making stop motion films as a teenager, is that the technology felt like this hurdle to overcome. And I also like my imposter syndrome often revolves around technology. Like, do I know the tech? Can I talk about technology in a way that shows other people that I can command it? And what I've learned over the years is that the technology is increasingly easy to learn, and it's the conceptual skills and the like philosophy and thinking behind it that's harder. And so I would just tell myself to stop worrying about that. Yeah. With visual effects, like I really want us to think about it as a medium that can do lots of things, right? We know that it's an amazing tool in the kit for in the way in which we tell spectacular, expensive, fantastic stories. We know that works, but I think what's really interesting right now is how, because it's becoming accessible in terms of the tools, like how can we use visual effects as an art medium? How can we also interrogate it a little bit more? So one of the things I've started doing is thinking about what is an anti-racist visual effects. What does that mean? Like, how do we look at the technology and the history of the technology? And I've been working with some researchers from Dartmouth and Yale and UC Santa Cruz to attack this question from many different angles. And we talked a lot about it at SIGGRAPH last week, but everything from shading, for our skin to hair to like even some of the two-dimensional technologies like color grading. Like how do these technologies and the legacy of the way in which we think about these technologies from the analog era also continue to haunt us in terms of equity and gender and race. And, we can do better. And I think it's our responsibility to really take that on.